So one of the points of this show is talking about people's careers and how they got to where they are today and sort of their path into science. And that's one of the things I'm really excited to talk to you about, because you seems like you have a non-traditional path into science. You took a non-traditional path.
Yeah.
And it's a huge path as far as I can gather. And it's kind of, I don't know where to start with it. So maybe we can start in the mid-'80s. And I brought with me today...
where'd you get that?
The internet has everything.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so this is a copy of the Whole Earth Review, right? Published in 1986.
Yeah, I don't remember the year, but
yeah, mid-'80s. And let's start talking about this for a while.
All right.
Because it's really cool, and it's the Whole Earth. I mean, the Whole Earth catalog is like one of the monumental sort of counterculture publications that basically came out of, the 60s, and this is a direct descendant of it. Like, it's one of the more successful issues of the review, I believe. Mm-hmm. And you edited this magazine, and it later got released as a Whole Earth catalog too, I think.
It did. So I guess that was 88 or 89. It got released as a book. I mean, a book version of that kind of.
Right. Yeah. And it's incredible who's in here. Like, so you edited, like, Stuart Brand, Ken Kesey is in here, Kevin Kelly is in here.
Yeah.
The Paul Krasner is in here.
Yeah.
That's insane. Yeah, that's crazy. So Paul, So I just want to let's talk about like the cultural context behind Whole Earth Review.
Yeah. Whole Earth Review was a magazine, and it was an incarnation of a prior magazine called Coevolution Quarterly. Coevolution Quarterly was a magazine that grew out of the Whole Earth Catalog series of books. The Whole Earth Catalog series was started by a guy named Stuart Brand. Stuart Brand had gone to Stanford and possibly majored in biology. I'm not sure.
He did. I looked that up.
Oh, he did.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So, and he was strongly influenced by Paul Ehrlich, who was at Stanford, and other people who I don't recall. Hence, he named his magazine Coevolution Quarterly. He is one of the icons of kind of the 60s counterculture, and he was a very different from a lot of things that were going on in the 60s. He was part and parcel of the 60s, and he shaped that era, but he was also very unique. He created something that he considered a catalog of tools, the Whole Earth catalog, and he defined tools very broadly. So it could be books, it could be actual tools. It could be almost anything. And basically it was, the Whole Earth catalogs consisted of hundreds of reviews written by people, and he only published reviews of good things. He didn't publish bad reviews. And these were reviews that guided you to various things. And there was a whole component of survivalism, back to the land kind of things that was a very strong component of these things, in which it's most often, the Whole Earth catalog is most often identified with. But then Stuart started publishing Coevolution Quarterly, and it was I think historically just a great magazine with lots of, no ads, long articles, quite a mix of things. And not everything, in retrospect, maybe good, but lots of good stuff. And I didn't start there till later, so I guess it was the 80s. I guess I started working at that time it was still, I believe, Coevolution Quarterly. And I had a friend named Jay Kinney, who was an underground cartoonist who I'd known for years, and through whom I met my wife, Rebecca Wilson, and who, as a Gnostic priest, presided at our wedding, ultimately. He got me a job there as a paste-up artist. So I just needed work, And I went there and started pasting up, which I guess people don't do anymore now that there's computer design and stuff. And then
Wait, where is this? Is this in the Bay Area?
I should mention. Yeah, it was in the San Francisco Bay Area, and the offices were in Sausalito, and they were down on the waterfront in Sausalito. Stuart lived adjacent to the offices in a houseboat, and the offices were in a sort of a converted, I'm not sure, sort of small warehouse building. So that's where I went to work. My wife to be at that point, Rebecca, also was working there. But at that point we knew each other already. And she was a graphic designer there. And I slowly rapidly actually kind of moved into proofreading and then copy editing. But at that time, Coevolution Quarterly became Whole Earth Review, and at that time, through an agent, a New York literary agent named John Brockman, who's still around and who's a very influential literary agent, they got a huge advance to do a Whole Earth software catalog, and they used a major part of that advance to do Whole Earth software review. So they were doing 2 magazines at that time, and they needed people. So I started doing copy editing for both magazines. But Kevin Kelly became the editor at that point.
Right. Kevin Kelly is probably most well known for being a managing or founding editor of Wired.
I think a founding editor. Was formerly founded something called Walking Magazine, maybe. Has written a number of sort of I don't even know, like
technology sort of culture technology books. Yeah.
Yes. So I know Kevin pretty well. He was my boss at that point, and he learned about my long-standing interest in strange beliefs and strange phenomena and pseudoscience and eccentric science, and at some point suggested that I guest edit an issue of Whole Earth Review devoted to that theme, which I thought was a great idea. And my wife designed that issue, and I we had another designer there too that helped design it, and I edited it, and we got to kind of hire all our favorite artists, and I got to go out and actually pay writers who I admired, like sort of experts on these kinds of weird subjects.
Yeah. Did you meet Paul Krasner?
I'm surprised you know who Paul Krasner is.
Okay, let's talk. Let's give some context for who Paul Krasner is. So there's The Realist, right, which is the prototypical sort of satirical underground, like publication that I think started in the 50s, right?
I think so. I think the late 50s.
Yeah, it sort of started it all. Started, all of that stuff. And Paul Krasner is the guy behind it, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And you had a subscription to The Realist in high school?
Yes.
Really?
Yes. So when I was in high school, I loved Mad Magazine. And I went into the Guide to Periodical Literature, something in my high school library, and I looked under humor magazines to see if there was anything in addition to Mad Magazine in that genre, and they listed The Realist. So I had no idea what it was, and I subscribed.
Yeah.
And so I read The Realist while in high school and knew who Paul Krasner was and really admired him and The Realist. And then, somewhat later, when I moved out to the San Francisco Bay Area, I met Krasner because he was part of this crowd that included Jay Kinney and other underground cartoonists and people like that. So I wound up there's a period of time where we all got together like once a week or something and hung out.
This is 70s?
Yeah. I moved to the Bay Area in something like 72. And so 72 through mid 80s. Is
this are you like hanging out with like Robert Crumb?
I I didn't exactly, hang out with him, but he was
Yeah.
part of that extended
Really?
crowd. My wife was an underground cartoonist. She knew Crumb better than I did. We visited Crumb in France.
Really?
At one point. Yeah, we happened to be traveling.
Yeah.
I had become a graduate student. I was in my last year.
Okay. This is like early 90s then?
This was mid-90s. So I think
Mid-90s.
94, there was an International Union for the Study of Social Insects quadrennial meeting in Paris, France. And afterwards we went on a little driving tour of France, and I also hit a few museums in Italy. And then we visited the Crumbs. Yeah.
That's insane. That's blowing my mind.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, going back to yeah, that's insane. Well, going back to the Whole Earth Review and sort of that how and your work that you did with them. An interesting thing about Stuart Brand and Kevin Kelly is there. And sort of this movement that came out of it was biology was a major part of it, right? And thinking about sort
Yes.
of more of sort of ecology, first wave sort of conservation aspect of it. But like as you said, Stuart Brand has an education in biology. I think Kevin Kelly does something that's similar, or maybe attached to the Encyclopedia of Life now, about describing species or cataloging all of that.
I don't know the details, but he was very active and probably is still active in trying to get people with money, especially Silicon Valley people, to contribute to just having every species described, every species on the planet described in a short period of time, like in a targeted goal of something like 5 to 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really interesting thing because sort of the counterculture was tied to, had strong ties to biology, which is kind of interesting and an interesting sort of cultural thing. So I wonder if when you were in it, had you studied biology yet, or were you studying other things before then?
So I had been in and out of undergraduate education and ultimately came away with something like 7 years of being an undergrad. But the only biology course I'd taken was at University of Chicago, and it was basically kind of like biology for poets or something. It was like a biology course for people who weren't going to be biologists, and that was the only course I'd had. And then I ultimately wound up going to Berkeley and majoring in computer science, and I took computer science sort of software, hardware kind of classes, and physics. I did the physics for, physics majors, and that's when, and then I think it was around then when I kind of left academia for the second or third time, and then I think that's when I wound up at Whole Earth Review. So it was only after that I very consciously decided, like, I'm going to become a biologist.
Okay. So why? Why did you decide that?
Well,
what was the what did you find in biology that you weren't finding in computer science and art and the things that you were studying before then?
I think something of a reality check, but because pure art, pure computer science, pure mathematics, as well as a whole lot of other human invented disciplines, have very little reference. I mean, are capable of sort of surviving with very little reference to the real world. And I was very attracted at that point to the real world, whether it be the physical world, the chemical world, or the biological world. But I have to say that I was always extremely interested in biology since I was a kid. I mean, I was the kind of kid that ran around outside catching frogs and snakes and insects, lots of insects, and trying to keep them alive and trying to read anything I could about them. I didn't have much of an adult advisory group to tell me anything, but I did know how to read, and so at an early age I learned what social insects were, and I kind of had the bare outlines of how they were organized, and that just amazed me, and it continued to amaze me on into adulthood. And so I was always reading popular science writing, and that's why I feel a great debt to people like Edward O. Wilson and Stephen Jay Gould and Carl Sagan. I mean, those are the people that ultimately influenced me to become a scientist. And I picked up Wilson's The Insect Societies when it came out. And I was in a Crocs and Brentanos in Calumet City, Illinois. I still remember. And I saw that book and I realized, oh my gosh, this distills into one place. And it looks pretty authoritative, all these things I'm wondering about. And I got that book. And I only read parts of it until I was in San Francisco. I recall I was working as a printer, and every day I had to commute to my job, and I brought that book along with me, and I read it on the streetcar and then the bus to my job, and on the streetcar and bus back from my job, and it really, really had a strong influence on me. And so at the point where I'd been working at Whole Earth for a while, I sort of realized I could go back to school. I guess I was also kind of turning 30, or I was kind of slightly past 30 at that point. And I thought, okay, I'm 30. This is what I'm doing when I'm 30. Like, what is it that I think I ought to be doing? And I mean, this is how I think. I thought, like, I need to have something that synthesizes everything that I care about and has to be important. It has to be like deal with, sort of the biggest questions I can imagine. And it was, to me, that was at that point evolutionary. In the past 3.5 billion years, how did life, everything I am is the result of evolution. And, if I want to understand like what's going on, I need to understand like evolution on planet Earth. That was the way I was thinking. And I just went back and I just went full bore into, I started at Sonoma. I went to Sonoma State because I lived at that point nearby.
Right.
It's in Rohnert Park, California. I got a great first year introduction to biology from some of those instructors who were great. They were great. And then I went back to Berkeley because I was considered I was a student in absentia at Berkeley. So I went back, only I changed my major with some difficulty because they didn't want me to just stay there forever.
Right.
But I was able to change my major to biology. It was biology. Evolution and systematics was the major. And I finished there.
Let me ask sort of a conceptual question off of that and off of your experience with Whole Earth. And especially the Whole Earth that you edited, basically talking about weird ideas and fringe stuff. As a biologist, was there, once you got into it, did it seem like you were on the other side of that? Right? You weren't the journalist. You were someone with deep knowledge in a fringe area. I wonder if you ever felt like that. You
mean deep knowledge in the fringe area of strange beliefs and eccentric science, like that?
No, not
deep knowledge in something like fungus growing ants.
In something that 99.9% of people don't know about and wouldn't think that it's possible to know that much about. Or
yeah. Oh, that occurs to me all the time.
Okay.
Lately, it's been occurring to me repeatedly that I'm basically a crypto-entomologist. So there's a section in the Fringes of Reason, both in the magazine version and the book version, about cryptozoology, which is the study of. It's basically like, it's kind of funny, but it's kind of serious too. It's the study of unknown animals. So at its more extreme, it's like the study of Bigfoot or the Loch Ness monster, where these things are, some people suspect that these things exist, but there's not really a whole lot of tangible evidence. And so you can nonetheless kind of take a scientific approach to studying them. So it's very interesting to look at something like the study of Bigfoot, where you have a spectrum of people who are looking into it. And on the one end, you have the kind of people that are more stereotypical, like, true believers, and they're not very grounded in science. And some of them even think like Bigfoot comes from UFOs and stuff. And then at the other end, you have, a couple actual scientists. There was the most representative of which was a guy named Grover Krantz, a physical anthropologist who's now deceased, but who tried to study the subject from a very scientific point of view. But at any rate, it occurs to me that, okay, none of those people get very much respect. Mm-hmm. What I do most of the time in my job now is I discover new species, and in entomology, that's a completely respectable thing to be doing. We go out, we look for, and we always find species that are unknown to science. Sometimes very odd species, and I think the people that get a thrill out of the, your sort of lay public, who gets a thrill out of hearing about the possible existence of the Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot, would get an equal thrill out of what I do if only they had the background knowledge to appreciate it, which they don't, and which is, a big if, because it's hard to impart enough background knowledge for them to then share the thrills,
Yeah. I mean, I think that's an interesting connection, right? Because, writing in Whole Earth and doing the editorial work that you did, it wasn't to make fun of fringe beliefs. It was it was just to sort of shine a light in this area of human interests and that what people did, right?
Yeah, because I have a extremely sympathetic feeling towards strange beliefs, because when I was a kid, in addition to all the other reading I was doing, I was a huge consumer of strange but true books. Mm-hmm. So there's a guy named Frank Edwards and Charles Fort, and there's there's an entire genre out there of more or less kind of scholarly, a lot of it is like what I call purple journalism, very, very low grade scholarship, but just essentially repeating anecdotes. But when I was a kid reading of strange things, stories of unknown animals, ghosts, flying saucers, aliens. When I was a kid, I read a lot of this stuff very uncritically, and believed all of it at times. Mm-hmm. And it was actually had a good effect on me, and I have a lot of sort of affection for those kind of strange beliefs. So yeah, the purpose of the book was to sort of celebrate that, but also to bring a kind of a grounding to it. So in a gentle way, I would have my ideal pair of articles would be 2 articles on the same subject, one by someone who kind of is less critical and one by someone who's more critical. And we actually manage that in a few cases, like with spontaneous human combustion and stuff. Mm-hmm. But if I could only have one writer, I would try to err a little bit on the side of someone who's slightly or much more critical. Mm-hmm. But never to treat the subjects with derision, but just to kind of say like, here's an introduction to this strange subject. And now here's kind of an assessment of it. Is there anything to this? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which I actually valued. And I think if there's any one thing that like influenced me to go into science, it was that. Like at some point, living in the Bay Area, having lots of friends who were more or less eccentric, believing every possible kind of eccentric belief you could imagine. At some point, I asked myself, like, what I care about whether I want my life to be filled with as much wonder as possible, but I have this additional requirement that it can't be like false wonder. It has to be wonder about things that are actually real and deserving of wonder. And how do I figure out like which of these things is in that category? I mean, some things are just myths that people made up, and then other things actually are real and could be explored and understood, ad infinitum kind of. And that's what I realized. Oh, it's objectivity and the scientific method that helps me to choose what to devote lots of hours to. So that.
Yeah, exactly. I think that seems like the main through line is the sense of wonder and having, being interested in discovering things, but taking that interest and using science and the critical method and reasoning to really explore, like you said, things that are grounded and sort of real.
Yeah.
Seems like the through line between the stuff you did with Whole Earth and your role as a scientist, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go back to grad school in Cornell, and let's talk about Bill Brown for a second. Can you put Bill Brown in perspective of entomologists and ant systematists and taxonomists?
Yeah, Bill Brown was in the upper tier of the pantheon of ant systematists. I mean, I don't think anyone would deny that. He's up there with the greatest of the greats. And I was really lucky to have him as a mentor. And I was older. I was an older. Sometimes we had little jokes about who was the oldest. I think there was one other graduate student, maybe two that were older than me. But I went in there with my eyes completely wide open. And I mean, among other things, I thought like other people were kind of bitching about how much money we got, and I was saying like, what, are you kidding? This is like better money than I was making in the external world. I could continue to do this for quite a while.
Yeah.
So I was really having a good time. I had 100% chosen it, and I was doing it, but I think I knew Bill was a great guy, but I didn't realize how great until I had spent some time there with him. And not only, I mean, he was in the middle of my time there, he retired. Mm-hmm. So he was very laid back, which I don't think would have been the adjective that his previous grad students would have used to describe him. So I think I benefited from that in a way.
Were you his last student?
I was his last student.
Okay.
Yeah. Uh-huh. And I was his only student for the 7 years that I was there, except briefly another grad student came in and didn't really like it and left. So for about a year I had an academic brother, and I was really happy, but that person didn't like working with Bill. So he was, in addition to knowing a lot about ant biology and ant systematics, he did not tolerate like academic bullshit at all. Academic politics. I mean, he was almost pathologically incapable of being political. In fact, and I don't really know the story behind it, but he somehow wound up at Cornell because he didn't get along with, I believe it was Ernst Mayr at the MCC, and I really don't know the details. Mm-hmm. But so for instance, I told him, Bill, I'm writing this proposal for an NSF fellowship, which at that time these were available. You could get I think it was a 3-year NSF graduate fellowship. Mm-hmm. And I applied for one early on, and I needed a letter from Bill. And he said, okay, I'll write you the letter, And so when I went back to check in on it like that, so Bill, did you write that letter? Oh, yeah, I wrote the letter, but I had to tell him, like, you don't really need the money. I mean, you already have this other fellowship, like that's the kind of, I mean, another time we said, like, Bill, we're writing this paper and we're going to submit it to Science. And he was like, what do you want to put something in that journal for? I mean, there's a lot of trash in that journal, stuff like that. He's like, totally, it was great.
Yeah.
It was totally great.
Yeah, I mean, he must have got a kick out of you as a student, right? Because you have such an untraditional background going into grad school, and like, I mean, part of what you did was being outside of the system, and the area that you worked in.
I think he appreciated that, and I remember one time talking to him about. I talked a lot about my past, so he knew, that I was totally a-traditional, and he also knew about the fringes and stuff. But I remember him saying once, well, it's kind of like what Martin Gardner wrote, right? And I was like, yeah, it's kind of like that, Fads and Fallacies in the Name of Science. So I don't know that he ever read it, but he knew that sort of, he had fitted into kind of a genre. And then towards the end, he wrote letters for me, and I was actually, after he died, the departmental secretary gave me one of the letters he'd written and said, I'm sure Bill would have wanted you to read this, and it was really, really nice. I mean, it was a really nice letter. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So, are there sort of things that you picked up from Bill that you that really sort of stuck in your brain and shaped how you are as a scientist or your approach to science?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Bill, it's an overused term, but he was very Darwinian in the sense that, and this is true of a lot of scientists, but he was a consummate naturalist, and he soaked up a lot of things he learned from field work and from the study of whole organisms and from the study of preserved specimens, and just kind of from a broad understanding of natural history, kind of distilled that into an evolutionary perspective. And he even published a number of sort of theoretical evolutionary papers, not theoretical in the sense of sort of mathematical modeling, but very theoretical from the point of view of generalizing evolutionary, sort of broad evolutionary mechanisms. And sort of, at one point I read the papers, I didn't think that much about them. As I kind of mature, I guess, I think more about, especially one of them that was centrifugal speciation. So I think he just sort of he just functioned under the assumption that the more you absorb from natural history, the better kind of evolutionary biologist you're going to be. I mean, first and foremost, primary was knowledge of the organisms and
natural history knowledge.
Not natural history knowledge.
Yeah.
So I've definitely, I wound up being in a natural history museum.
Right.
I really lucked out, and I was kind of primed for it, I think.
Mm-hmm. Did he push you towards fungus gardeners, or was that something that you brought in?
No, at one point he said, well, it's about time we found you a subject.
How many years in was that?
It was probably about a year in or so. Okay. Not much more than a year, but it could have been a little less. It's about time we found you a dissertation topic. And I thought, I actually didn't like that, because I thought hey, I'm still exploring here. I was sitting in the library just reading stuff about Heteroptera and stuff. I was reading just everything, just trying to figure out what my entree would be. But at any rate, I thought, well, I can do whatever it is we talk about, and in addition, so maybe it's a good idea. So it was very funny. I mean, I sat at a desk with him, and he got out a list of all the ant genera, and he just started going through the genera. Okay, this one. Oh well, somebody just revised that 20 years ago. That's fine. No, we don't. That one's been done. This one. No, that one's been done. This one, no, it's too big, Just going down the list. And then he got to one, Myrmecina. Uh-huh. He's like, yeah, Myrmecina. Yeah, that's manageable. Yeah, why don't you work on Myrmecina? And I said, well, Bill, is it okay if I work on it for a while and decide? if I really want to do this or not? And he's like, sure, yeah, that's fine, you know? So, either in that conversation or I think it was in that conversation he had gotten to the fungus growing ants. And I guess I'd already been looking at fungus growing ants. And I said, yeah, what about those, Bill? Like I'm very interested in those. And he was like, yeah, that's a possibility. Yeah, maybe. Yeah. But then somehow it wound up Myrmecina, you know? Uh-huh. So I did work on Myrmecina for a while, just sort of acquainted myself with the literature, got a lot of specimens. And then at some point I went to him and I said, Bill, I've decided, you know, and at this point I had decided, I want to work on fungus growing ants. And I didn't know what he would say. Like, I probably have to debate this with him or something. He was like, okay, fine. Yeah, that's good. It's good to, you know what you want to do, you know? And that was it.
Wow. Jeez. That was it. Yeah, that was the birth of your career. That's crazy.
I know when I think back. I mean, so many things are, this is just true of life, I think. It's sort of like evolution. It's sort of like phylogenies. If you take an endpoint and trace backwards, how much is contingency? I mean, it's like when you see where these sort of nodes were, where a minor perturbation might have, but I think also, I think fungus growing ants, they were very deep in my brain since I had been a kid. I mean, my mom had given me this book, a very simple book about ants, and it had something about fungus growing ants in it. So I was kind of, in some ways it was kind of a thing, kind of model system versus totem animal, model system versus totem animal kind of. And I was thinking about all these other groups as, oh, this would be really good for understanding like the evolution of bizarre morphology or something, you know. And then but then it was always fungus growing ants because they are such a complex and seemingly improbable endpoint of evolution.
Mm-hmm. Do you regret taking so much time to start your career in science, or do you see that past experience and your experiences in journalism and in the Bay Area through that time as something that without it you wouldn't be where you are today?
Yeah, the latter.
Yeah.
I don't regret it.
Uh-huh.
And that's not to say that I didn't waste a lot of time, and even being a journalist or whatever. I mean, I just goofed off a lot in my 20s. I mean, I went out to the San Francisco Bay Area, and one of my goals was to goof off, which I did. Mm-hmm. That's time I guess I could have spent, learning more about biology, I guess. And the other thing is, well, here I am now at, if you add up the years I've been in this job, 20 years, I'm kind of what most people would consider mid-career, I guess, a typical academic. I'm actually much older than that. So I guess if I was thinking of myself on a traditional trajectory, I kind of didn't have as many years as I could have. But what I think outweighs all of that is that, what I did in my 20s, for me, I mean, I learned a lot. I did a lot that was important to who I am. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure I would be the scientist I am even if I hadn't had those experiences. But the other thing is, and I think the most important thing is, I didn't know what I wanted to do until that, 31, 32, when I said, like, okay, how am I going to like synthesize everything I care about in the maximally most kind of efficient way that employs all these things. Also all my skills, kind of. I just had this idea. I couldn't have done that earlier. And I think I might have started off in some false direction and spent a bunch of years not enjoying myself. So I can't regret it, because it was only then that it all came together and I kind of realized, and on top of that, and I think, there's a huge luck component here. I got really lucky, man. I had a great grad career. I walked into this job without a postdoc, and it's a great job. And I've been able to kind of define my research goals ever since. Like, would that have happened if I'd have sort of gotten into biology at the age of 25? Who knows? I mean, it just all worked out so well. Mm-hmm. So I really can't spend time regretting much.
Yeah. I was just curious. No, yeah. I wouldn't regret it either. I wonder how that translates into your conversations with students.
Oh, that's a good one. I'm a kind of an honest person, so I've had a number of such conversations where I've had undergrad interns and grads, students, and especially with some of the undergrads, they've asked, they know about, of course they find out about my past, and then they're sort of thinking, like, they're not really sure about what to do and what to do next. And they ask me things like, do you think it'd be really bad if I took like a year off and went and did organic farming or something like that? And I think I would be a total hypocrite if I said like, oh no, actually when I was an undergrad at Berkeley, and I was an older undergrad, I had an advisor who will go unnamed. And I went to him at one point and I said, you know what? I'm pretty sure I want to go to graduate school. And do you think there will be a bias against me since I'm older and I'm only getting my bachelor's now in like my mid-30s? And he was like, you bet there'll be a bias against you. Are you kidding me? We have people getting their PhDs at the age of 21 and stuff. Oh, yeah, you're in big trouble. And I went away really depressed. And then I happened to know some graduate students who I had gotten to know, and I told them about it. And they were like, oh, don't listen to him. He's crazy. He's wrong. Anyway, I wouldn't do that. I tell these students, okay, you know me. I'd be a hypocrite to tell you otherwise. The number one most important thing is to know what you want to do, to really have a clear idea kind of what it is you love, what it is that just thrills you to do it, a well that will never run dry. And the only way to find that out, there's only one way. You have to explore different things. And I don't think so. So for that reason, taking some time off is a good thing. You need to do it with your eyes wide open that this is the minority opinion and that most academics are going to say like, hey, what were you doing for those 2 blank years? On the other hand, there are blank years and there are blank years. Blank years between undergrad and graduate school is far less harmful than, say, blank years in the middle of graduate school, or probably blank years anytime after that. I mean, that's good. So now is actually, if you're going to do it, now's a much better time to do it than later. That's the kind of advice I give. I mean, I don't think I even give this to my own daughter. So, along with some tiger parenting as well. So, so that, yeah, it's kind of funny. It does come up.
Yeah. Oh, that's good advice. I think it's a good approach. So let's cap this off by talking about your position now in the Smithsonian. And you said you walked into it. What does that mean?
Well, it means I didn't have to go. I got hired while still in grad school. So I mean, if you look at the way I did things in retrospect, it's like, wow, what a great strategy. I had a couple in my last year, which was 94, 95, I had a number of high profile papers, but it wasn't planned. None of that was planned.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, and this is rare in systematics, and people may think there was a golden age when it was less rare. Well, if there was, it preceded my time. But, 20 years ago, it was the same as it is now, like, systematics jobs are rare. In that year, there were a number of great systematics jobs, and I was in a position to apply for all of them. I mean, I was just, I'd like to say I planned it all, but, this is another example of, sort of random events and sort of being poised to maybe take advantage of them. And I just happened to be poised. I was sort of finishing up. And so I applied for all of them, or 3 or 4 of them. And I wound up getting offered this job.
Mm-hmm.
And I got offered this job something like April of that year. I wasn't finishing till, I think my official graduation was August. So I knew once I knew I had a job. It was so great. I knew I could finish up, and then I had a job to go to. I came to this job. I also had a couple postdocs. Ironically, one here at the Smithsonian. So it was pretty clear I wasn't going to do that one.
Yeah.
I had another one where I had asked, could I go and do that postdoc for 2 years before I come here? And due to the crazy bureaucracy here with which I was not familiar at that time, and now I'm abundantly familiar with, and it seems obvious now, I couldn't do that. But they said, I'll tell you what, you come here and you can do the first 2 years you're here, you can essentially do that postdoc. So that's what I kind of did. I had no other responsibilities, and I did what I would have done on the postdoc. So that's what I mean by walking in. I got a job. I was very lucky.
Mm-hmm. How do you think? Do you think your career from that point forward was specific to a position in a museum rather than a position in university academia?
So I sort of consciously tried to keep myself viable as a university. I always thought I would wind up at a university, only because museum jobs are just so rare. It's hard to sort of spend a lot of time trying to prepare for a museum job because they're just extremely rare. So I just was sort of poised in my mind to wind up at a research university, you know. But when I wound up here, I wasn't sure. It's very funny, but I wasn't sure how long it would last. I kind of thought that the Smithsonian has had its share of budgetary problems over the years, and I thought maybe things might go bad, and maybe I would have to find another job. And even that aside, I just tried to sort of do everything to the extent that I could that a professor would do. Obviously, I didn't teach, but I've always not always, but I've had graduate students. I had NSF grants. I've been continuously funded by NSF grants since I started, since after maybe my first year here, including a couple of fairly large ones. So I always felt like I would be a viable candidate for an outside university job if I ever wanted one. And it's only really been like kind of in the last 5 years where I've realized like, oh no, I'm here permanently. This is my home. I'm here.
Yeah. So, well, let's talk about here to finish it. So the Smithsonian is in DC, right?
Yes.
And science, as it is in the U.S., is a publicly funded thing, right? And funds come from government budgets a lot of the time, and state budgets for science. And the Smithsonian is in the center of everything. It's on the National Mall, right? And you have things like congressional nights at the museum.
Yes, we do.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. Do you find yourself having to sort of evangelize for the sake of basic scientific research? Do you find yourself explaining the benefit of research because you're at the Smithsonian and because it's a direct access to? I do,
yes. So when I first got here, John Coddington was the chair of my department, and one of his offhand remarks was, "Oh, you're going to get really into federal politics once you get here." And I thought, what? Really? Why? But it was absolutely true. The first year I was here, I believe it was 95. So I had just gotten here. I arrived with probably 50 live fungus-growing ant colonies, which I cared for at that time. I didn't have any assistants at that point. And then the government shut down. So I was in the middle of the government shutdown, and then there also was snow shutdown that sort of followed the government shutdown. So I became very politicized very rapidly about. I couldn't believe I was being locked out of the lab where my aunts needed me to feed them. Mm-hmm. So I think in my daily research life, I'm a little bit insulated, but when I've been department chair twice, and so for 3 plus 2 or something like that, at least 5 years of my career here have been spent being an administrator. And in that context especially, I find myself frequently leading tours or otherwise for Congress people or members of the board or something that are in which one of my goals is to, in a brief period of time, make them understand that our collections and our research are an essential part of the infrastructure of science and it translates into economics. It translates very easily into economics. Even in just my research life, whenever there's an opportunity, I take it. So if there's a congressional night, I put up a table and a couple of us go down there and we interact with people and just try to explain to them what we do. And inevitably they ask, like, why is it important? I mean, you had a question earlier where, people can't understand how you could study ants for any length of time. Right. I'm constantly reminded of it by interacting with any non-scientist or even non-biologist. They'll say, like, oh, well, how much is there to study about ants? And then I have to explain, and I've hopefully learned to do this in a brief period of time, like just how many ants there are and how many species there are and how essential they are to almost every ecosystem, et cetera, So, and there's always frequently what people are really asking is, what impact does this have on either human health or human economics? So I have to try to explain that to people. But I don't know that. I mean, I suspect I have to do it more than, say, some university researcher out in the Midwest or something. But I think we all have to do it at one time or another, and I think it's really important. In fact, one of the questions we've started asking graduate students in their A exams is that, like, what? Okay, you've got 2 minutes in an elevator with a congressperson. Like, how do you explain why what you're doing is important, generally important?
Yeah. So for you, is that communication a communication of this idea of wonder and discovery and sort of knowledge seeking, and isn't this cool sort of to think about something that not a lot of people think about, but it's there, or is it mixed with that plus economics all the time?
It's both.
Yeah.
And so it's a little bit hard to do in 2 minutes.
Yeah.
And so I have to kind of think about the audience and which of the two they need to hear more about. I think when it's a low pressure thing, it's usually that if I tell people 3 parallels between ant civilizations and human civilizations, they are blown away, and they frequently say to me, "I'm never going to step on an ant again," or
right.
I'm not, next time I see ants in my kitchen, I'm just going to leave them alone. Things like that. Like they simply don't know. It's total anthropomorphization, and yet it's totally justified in my opinion.
Yeah,
I mean, it's why I got into it personally. So I think it's exactly what I needed to hear at some point in my life and what they need to hear. But if it's more like, what are you guys in the Smithsonian, like, we give you like $750 million a year, and what are you sitting around doing? How does that benefit anybody? Then it's a little bit more about the human useful compounds that have come out of fungus growing ants and their associated microbes, or maybe an understanding of sort of epidemiological dynamics that we can understand in this sort of separate objective system with the ants and their various microbial diseases, and or farming dynamics, the dynamics of long-term agriculture that we can learn from these creatures that have actually been doing a total analog of agriculture for 50 million years, stuff like that. And maybe if I'm talk fast, I can get them both.
Right, right.
And I think that's what I'm going for. Mm-hmm. And what I think people are really asking when they
mm-hmm.
ask about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, is there anything we didn't get to that you want to talk about, or?
You could completely cut this out if you want to, but the other thing about sort of that I've learned about Washington politics and economics and stuff is that the Smithsonian budget is really kind of a drop in the bucket of the total budget of mm-hmm. the federal government, but it's inadequate for what they're, and of course probably you might expect anyone in the Smithsonian would be saying this, but it's inadequate for the mission, and it's inadequate in one way for the mission that is everyone can see and is aware of. They're constantly telling us to build new museums and not giving us, they might give us enough money to actually build the building and then not enough to staff it. Mm-hmm. But that's just the part that people think of when they think of the Smithsonian. The other part, which is research, we have a huge research program here, a huge collections that need constant curation, and a completely kind of shrinking staff, and a flat budget, which is essentially a negative budget because flat means negative when mm-hmm. every year costs go up and budget stays flat. And it's almost as if the Smithsonian's unable to make the point that we have a huge research program here that needs to be funded.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it isn't the remedy of that sort of increasing the public perception of what it means to be a museum and what it means to be a research scientist in a museum?
Yes, because it's generally the case. It's not just that I think it. It's been proven with all kinds of surveys we've done here that people are completely unaware that there is, that something like 3/4 of the building is behind the scenes, off limits to the public, populated by researchers actively doing research. They just don't know that. So it is partly a public relations thing. People should know what we're doing, and I think they would be thrilled about it. And we're getting better at that. We're getting a lot better at that.
That's a modern challenge that a lot of biologists face, is really trying to build ways to communicate what they do and to build value and perception of value in basic biological research, because that's really the core foundation of where support for us comes from and for our jobs comes from, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I know what I was going to say. So, and it's relevant to that. We have two funding channels, and I don't think this is true of any other government agency. We are allowed to raise trust funds, non-federal funds, and we have federal money. So, simply making the general public more aware of what we do could impact both of those revenue streams.
Right. Yeah.
And I think it's sort of involving the public more in what we do. I think it could really work. Mm-hmm. A lot of what we do is actually, regular people could participate.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're over an hour, but thanks for talking to me. This was great.
I hope it's good.
No, it was good. Thanks. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you.